So I'm going to open the meeting at 6:02. My name is Cynthia Krass. I'm the chair of the Capital Finance Task Force, and this is our October 5th meeting. We don't have to approve the agenda if I remember correctly. So we'll go right to the first item, which is welcome everybody, and chair's comments. I don't have any major, profound substantive comments. I just wanted to make a couple notes. And then we'll go to, I asked if we could do some introductions, just because a lot of us are getting to know each other. And even though we've done introductions, so those are the two things I want to cover in the welcome. I am a kind of a rule follower. Maybe that's why I got asked to chair this. And I do think that it's really important that we make the chat, we use the chat in the best way that can support these meetings, and that is that we don't put anything substantive in the chat, but that we do use the chat to be recognized to comment or question. It's a lot easier for the chair or anybody that's taking questions. You can keep, it's also kind of a democratic process, because then you have a timestamp and an order, and it makes it easier to, see who's raised their hand in what order. And so it just makes it easier to chair the meeting if you use the chat to be recognized. And then also it's just a little more fair process. So I'm kind of a big fan of that. And then also, again, not putting anything substantive, because the chat does not become part of the record. So it's just a good habit to not put substantive material in the chat. Okay, with that, so again, I'm Cynthia Krass, and I am the chair of the Transportation Advisory Board. That's how I landed here. And gosh, I guess I'm gonna have to call on you because you won't know. Let's see, I'll just go in the order that you're on. Mine will include committee members as well as staff. So Tina, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tina Eggers. I'm Chief of Staff, and I'm here just to observe and be of help and host the meeting. So let me know if I can be doing anything different. Thanks.
Okay, Andrea, and then Brad.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Andrea Snyder. I'm the Deputy City Administrator for the city, and as such, I oversee public works and community planning and development, and have special projects like this task force. Good to see you all again.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Book. I'm the chair of the Park Board, and nice to be back and seeing everyone as well.
Councilmember Goodman, then Councilmember Hall.
Hi, I'm Stacy Goodman, and I'm on the City Council. And it's a great meeting last time, so I'm really looking forward to today.
And hi, everyone. Zach Hall from the Issaquah City Council.
Jamie, and then Jason.
Hi, everyone. Got to join for about 30 minutes of the last meeting, so pretty glad to get the opportunity to spend a whole meeting with everyone. I am vice chair of this task force, as well as the environmental board, which I'm representing.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Jason, Jason Voice. I am currently a commissioner on the Planning Policy Commission, and I also recently served on the Recovery Task Force for the city. I'm just really looking forward to being here with all of you guys and learning some wonderful things about how our city works, and hopefully we can come up with some great solutions. So, thank you.
Parker, and then Susan, and then Tim. Parker, if you're talking, you're on mute. Let's come back to Parker. We're not hearing you. And if we could go to Susan and then Tim.
Hi, I'm Susan Leonelli. I'm currently serving as chair of the Issaquah Human Services Commission, and nice to see you all. Thank you.
Hello, Tim Flood, South Lake Sammamish area, T-ball coach, interested party.
Councilmember Martz and the screens, you guys all changed places. I'm seeing a name on here that I don't recognize, Benton Koblenz, but let's go ahead and introduce, let Councilmember Martz introduce himself, and then.
Yeah, hi everybody. Nice to see you all again. Councilmember Tola Martz in my 12th year on the council.
It looks like we have Parker back and Benton is gone. Oh, no, Benton, sorry about that. Parker, is anyone else able to hear Parker? Is it just me? No, okay.
I'm still seeing Benton, not hearing Parker.
I saw Parker do a face palm, so it sounded like maybe we were going to get him. Okay, well, when you come back online, send me a wave, do an arm wave so we know. And then, hello, Benton.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Benton Koblenz. I'm the Economic Development Coordinator for the City of Issaquah, and I'm here in the guise of Recovery Coordinator tonight because part of the conversation will be about the funding from the American Rescue Plan Act, and so I'm here to answer any questions.
Excellent. It's nice to meet you. Thank you. Okay, so at this point in the agenda, if I'm following correctly, it's the minutes, and there were draft minutes in your packet. So I'm seeking approval as presented. I'm hearing no objection, and I'm going to call that approval by unanimous consent. Seeing lots of nods, so it looks like I walked to that one okay. And that brings us to item number 3, public comment. Do we have any public comment? Deputy
Hi,
City Manager.
I'm checking the public room, and we do not have any public attendance. Thank you.
Okay, well, that brings us to the substance. And it looks like we'll be turning this over to Andrea. She's going to give us a presentation on revenue and etc. Andrea, you ready?
Yes, thank you. Good evening again. So while Tina is pulling up those slides, I want to give a bit of a disclaimer in that while I am trained in public finance, I am not a public finance expert. And so you will likely have some questions tonight that I won't be able to answer on the spot, and I apologize for that, but I will then be able to come back to you with more answers. So you may not be aware of this, but the city is currently in between finance directors. And so unfortunately, we don't have a finance director who's able to bring their expertise to bear. So you're stuck with me, but I do have some training in this. And like I said, if you have questions that I cannot answer, then we can. The intent is to get those answers back to you at a later time. So with that disclaimer aside, the purpose of the evening, this is the next slide, the purpose of the evening is for us to gain a general background on what our existing revenues are that we collect as a city, as well as the potential revenues that we could collect, that state law would allow us to collect, and have an initial conversation. This isn't the last conversation, it's really the first conversation about which of these potential revenues are worth exploring further. If there's anything that we can eliminate from this meeting, then great. If there's preferences that emerge and just kind of our first gut reactions, that's really the level of conversation that I'm looking for. And then perhaps even more importantly, to gather questions. You're going to have questions, you're going to want more specific information about some of these options, how they relate to the city financing, how they relate to the capital projects that we have in our capital improvement plan. And so this is a great time to gather questions. It would provide us as the administration time to put those answers back to you so that we're prepared to have even more information at our next conversation on financing options. So please bring forward any questions that you have. Really welcome them, and that would be great. And the other thing that I wanted to make sure that we talk about this public financing 101 first, before we get into project criteria, which is really our next meeting, if you recall from our scheduled meetings, is that we go into discussing projects and project criteria to try to prioritize those projects. We go into that conversation understanding that we have some financial constraints and understanding that whatever we prioritize, we still need to find a way to pay for, right? And so we've had conversations in the past where we talk about what do we want on our wish list, and then when it comes to actually understanding the cost of those things, we realize we can't afford everything on the list. So we're trying to front load the project criteria conversation with really an understanding on what are some of our financial realities and whatever some of our options are for raising revenue. So that's why we're kind of sequencing it in this way, and our next meeting is going to be more on project criteria and how we prioritize those projects in the CIP. So that's really the purpose of today and why we're discussing public financing today. So next slide, please, Tina. So that means our agenda today is to provide information, overview of the revenue that the city currently collects. We're going to be taking a look at some of the revenues as proposed in the 2022 proposed budget. And then we'll be looking at past bond and levy measures that the city has attempted, some successful, some not so successful. And there will be a discussion on some of the lessons learned. We have a lot of expertise on this task force of people who were really involved in the transportation bond and have some insights to share. So we'll have a small discussion on that to see what lessons learned, what advice we might take into the future. And then we'll be looking at those potential new revenue sources. What are our options? And then the discussion will be, again, on do we have preferences emerging for revenue sources that are worth exploration further? Do we have, what are our questions? What more information do we need to know about these to really try to prioritize and make some recommendations? That is the agenda for today. Next slide, please. Great. Before we get into our revenue sources that we currently collect, I just wanted to pause and talk about operating versus capital expenses, and just to make sure we're all on the same page with what these things mean. Capital expense is really the money that's required to acquire or maintain major physical assets like roads, buildings, even major software systems. These are capital projects. These are what were outlined in the CIP, and we went over those really quickly last time. CIP, again, capital improvement project. Operating expense is more ongoing, right? It's maintenance, it's staff wages, it's things like even smaller supply and equipment expenses, including fuel. It's not major costs, but they are typically ongoing, required for continuous operations. And the importance of this slide is that some of our revenues are really well suited for capital expenses, and some of our revenues are really well suited for operating expenses. And we try to match revenues that are ongoing, steady, predictable to our expenses that are ongoing, rather steady and rather predictable. And when we try to match some of our one-time monies towards capital expenses, because you don't want to have one-time monies going towards operations, because if you don't have that revenue source in the following year, or it's very volatile or hard to predict, that can make paying for ongoing things very difficult. So that's really why I wanted to talk about operating versus capital expenses and how they relate to our revenues, which I think we're about to launch into the next slide. Great. Thank you, Tina. Perfect. So this is a quick overview of what's in the proposed budget for 2022. The total city budget is $145 million, and that budget contains several different funds that you see here in this graph. These funds are generally set aside for different purposes, specific purposes. So we have, of course, the largest fund is the general fund, and that fund is for a lot of our ongoing and operating activities, we also pay off some of our debt with that fund. And we're going to talk about the general fund more in a little bit. You'll see the second largest fund that we have is the utility funds. These come from the utility rates that our ratepayers pay. So if you're a City of Issaquah water customer, your bill would go into the utility funds, and same with sewer and stormwater, et cetera. So that's really our second largest fund. And then we have a bunch of other funds as well. So really the main ones that we use to pay for our capital projects in our capital improvement plan would be general fund, utility fund, capital projects, and of course some of our debt service too. Next slide, please. And also, I should say, if you have questions on these slides as we go through, please write question in the chat so that I'm not just blowing past your question or anything. So do use that chat for exactly as Cynthia outlined. That would be great, because I don't want you to have questions and then forget them and I get too far ahead in the slides here. So let's dive a little deeper into the general fund, because it is our largest fund. And this is a breakup of the different things that we pay for out of that fund. So overall, the general fund totals to $61 million and change. And you can see here that we pay for a variety of things out of that fund, including police and fire services. We also have our community planning and development department, the finance, human resources, municipal court, parks is a big part of that general fund. And so I just wanted you to be aware of all the types of services that come out of this fund. There's a lot of expenses that are competing for funds within the general fund. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into some of the revenues that go into the general fund. So each of these revenues are specific to the general fund and help pay for all those things that we just saw. And so first is the property tax. This generally, property tax is a staple for Washington cities. You can see that our property tax here, we predict to be about $10 million for 2022. Property tax is generally seen as very reliable, very steady and stable, because we generally know how much it's going to grow by every year. And we also, one thing that's important to know about the property tax is by state law, we are restricted to raising property tax as a city. We can only raise it 1% every year. Now you see that the property tax revenue is actually growing larger than 1% every year. And that's because while we may be able to increase the general rate of the property tax, it can also grow when there's new construction added or when the assessed value of the property goes up. So that's how property tax works. And I'm going to pause here because I see we have a question from Susan.
Thank you, and my apologies. I was sending it to the host, so I now know I should send it to all panelists, so thank you. I am so sorry, but could I ask you to just go back a couple slides? I just had a couple specific questions just for my orientation. And the sources, yes, this one. I know you didn't talk about special revenue funds or internal service funds. I'm just wondering if you could characterize just really briefly what those are for.
Oh boy.
If you can. We can take it offline if that's more appropriate.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. I think, you know, the bulk of what we're really talking about here today for the purposes of our conversation really has to do with the general fund for the most part. But I can get back to you with what some of those examples of expenses in the internal service funds and special revenue funds may be.
Thank you. And then one other thing maybe to add to that later list is on the next slide, which is interfund transfers, which is not a small amount. And I just want to understand exactly, not exactly, but just roughly what that is. And again, we can use that as a follow-up.
Yeah, so we can take money from the general fund and transfer it to another fund that we would have. So, for example, if if we have some debt that we've taken on to pay for a signal project or a road project, we might use general fund money to help pay off that debt, for example. And so we may transfer it to another type of fund. So that's really what that is taking money out of the general fund into putting it into other city funds to help pay for those different services.
And so for 2022, that's sort of claimed already for other purposes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Then I think we're on the next slide. Great. Thank you so much, Tina. So property taxes, we talked about those. Sales tax, we have really seen a lot of growth over the pandemic as people are staying home a little bit more, working from home more, they're making more purchases in Issaquah. And really prior to the pandemic, we were concerned about the growth in sales tax, and during the pandemic, it's been stronger than really what we've seen. So that has been good, at least one upside during the pandemic. But really, in general, the sales tax is volatile and it's subject to pretty significant swings because it's really dependent on the economy and on how our retailers are doing. And you know, one of the things that has affected our sales tax in the past and our sales tax revenue growth has been increased competition from surrounding cities as they develop more businesses and more retail centers, and as well, of course, is Amazon, which is also you know, a concern for the Issaquah businesses. Business and occupation tax is a little bit more stable than sales tax because it taxes more than retailers. It's a tax on the gross income of a business and pertains to all different types of businesses. And we can see that that has also grown over the past 2 years, and we expect it to continue to grow at a fairly modest rate. But it is like sales tax, it's subject to how the economy is doing, and so it's less predictable, less stable than the property tax. Utility tax, there's, I think we talked about this in our last session, but let me say it again. We have, as a city, we have utility rates. As a utility provider, it's how much you pay for your water, dependent on how much water you use, for example, and then there's a tax on top of that. We charge utility taxes for electricity, water and sewer, cable, telephones, etc. And so that's what the utility tax is, and those funds from the tax go into the general fund. The money that you pay as a ratepayer on the utilities that you consume, that goes into the utility fund, which we saw earlier. So this is a general fund revenue, the utility tax. And then there's other revenues that we receive for the general fund, right? We have grants, we have fees, and parks fees and community planning and development fees, other types of fees like that, and certainly grants as well. And so that is an overview of the types of major revenues that we have going into the general fund to pay for all of those different services. Any questions on this slide? Councilmember Goodman, you have a comment?
Well, I do have a comment, and I'm only going to mention it because it's a complicated subject. And so if everybody's clear on it, I apologize. For property tax levies, and we just talked about this last night, illustrating the complexity of it. Andrea mentioned that the city can only, I'm not sure it was super clear, but the city, well, everybody in the state, the limit is that the city can only collect 1% more than it collected the year before. I think that does not include new construction. The city cannot collect 1% more from each property owner. If the city collected $100,000 in property tax, and it's not more than that, it can only collect 1% more the next year, and then it gets spread over the properties in the city. So that's a real strict limit. That's different than the city sort of assessing 1% more. It's you can only collect 1% more. I just want to be really clear on that.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. The way that property tax is calculated in Washington State has to be the most complex, and so it takes quite a bit of time to fully understand all of the nuances. So I appreciate that clarification. Next slide, please.
Tim has a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. It looks like other revenues. I mean, that's usually a catch-all, but it looks like a huge portion there for 2021 and a huge driver of the coming in under budget there. Can you expand, or maybe you're going to expand on what constitutes other revenues, and then why there was such a, are we running with a $15 million surplus as a result of kind of underestimating that for 2021?
So I think that part of that is when some of those revenues were put on our books. There may have been some that we were anticipating before in 2020, but actually we received in 2021. Also, I think part of this might be a large grant that we received from King County for the Bergsma property. That's my best guess, but let me get back to you with more information, because you're right, that is a big swing for the other revenues, and I can get back to you with more information about what that is.
Thank you.
I see Councilmember Martz has a comment.
Yes, thank you. I still don't understand. If you have a boat and you have 6 people in the boat and you collect a certain amount of money from them, and then the next day you collect 1% more money total. You collect $10, right? And then the next day you collect $10.10 total from those 6 people. But you ask each of those 6 people, how much more did I collect? And they each say 3.5%, which is the average annual increase in property tax collected. I don't understand how that math works. I'm pretty good with math, but I don't understand if the average across those 6 people is 3.5%. I don't understand how the city's only collected 1% more total.
In your analogy, the next day when you go back to those 6 people, there's actually a 7th. And so that's what changes the total amount that you collect, because that 7th person would represent the new construction. A lot of the new construction that has occurred off of Newport, et cetera, that is in addition to that 1% limit.
Right, but the 1% only applies to the existing 6 people. We could collect a bunch more money from that 7th person, but the 6 people, I can only collect 1% more from those 6 people.
Yes.
But yet the average tax increase is 3.5. Oh, so the 3.5% is the
King County's cut.
Is across all 7, and the 7th person, they collected nothing the previous year. So
correct, because the 7th person wasn't in the boat.
I
They
see.
hopped
So
into the boat the second. Yeah.
Okay, I get it. So if you collect $1 from them, it's now $11 over 7 people. I got it now. Okay, thank you. That's what I didn't get last night. I appreciate you taking the time in this meeting to help me understand. I now get fractions. I guess I understand fractions now. Thank you.
The boat metaphor is a really handy one.
It's the 7th person. When you average out over all 7, you're not averaging over 6 anymore. You're averaging over 7. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. I think, Brad, you had a question? Oh, wait. No, I'm sorry. I'm getting out of order here. Jamie.
Yeah, Andrea, the other revenues, or just in general, does this include those ARPA funds, or is that something that is not included in this year?
So we had received some ARPA funds this year. So you know what? That might be a huge part of it, actually. Thank you for that. We are supposed to get additional funds from ARPA as well, but we've gotten our first batch. So that may be what it is. Thank you. Okay, next is Brad.
Maybe this will get covered later, but since it was a couple slides back, I kind of wanted to address it now, and it kind of relates to transfer of funds slide that you had mentioned, where they can move money around into the general fund. And I guess my question relates to impact fees, which should primarily be for capital improvements, I would think. So where does impact fees go in terms of a fund, and can it be transferred into the general fund, or is that where it goes in the first place?
I can give you a guess, but I'd rather give you an accurate answer that I'm very confident in. So I'm going to come back to you with that information.
Okay.
We learned about that a little bit when in the prior task force, and the impact fees, when you do a new development or improvement and you pay impact fees, they go into certain buckets and they're limited to what they can. Like get enough money into that bucket, then you can go ahead and leverage it for that specific use. And in terms of transportation projects, one thing that was not necessarily intuitive is just because it's on Newport Way, all this development, all this cash comes in, it can be spent on transportation projects, but not necessarily on Newport Way, or to directly address the impact of that development. And that may be different when it comes to schools and things like that. But for transportation, it goes into kind of the transportation bucket, but citywide transportation bucket.
Thanks, Tim.
Just for your clarity, Andrea, I guess what I wanted, at least relating to parks, because now we do have some impact fees relating to parks, which I'm not sure was always the case many years ago. Does that money go into the general fund, and can it be spent for something other than parks?
So I'd like to get back to you with more information, because I think there's impact fees, concurrency fees, there's mitigation funds. And so I want to have a detailed and accurate answer for you, because we charge different things. And we some things we set aside for very specific purposes. But like I said, let me come back to you with a more detailed response.
Thanks.
Great. And any of these questions that I'm going to come back to you with, I will send to the full task force so that everybody has the same information. Okay, and then Councilmember Goodman, you don't have a comment, you're good? Okay. All right, next is real estate excise tax, or REIT, as we call it. Not going to get too far into the weeds with REIT. Real estate excise tax, as it sounds like, is the tax that is paid on the sale of real estate, sale of property. So whether that's the sale of a single family home or the sale of a large commercial building, there is a real estate tax that comes along with that, and we receive those revenues. And the real estate tax can be very volatile and hard to predict, because of course it's dependent on the sale of a property. If the old Swedish hospital, for example, sold tomorrow, that would be several $1 million. It's a large building. Or it could, not sell at all, right? And so you can have these situations where one large property really changes the amount of revenue that's collected. And that's really hard to predict, the sale of those types of properties. And so in general, this tax is very volatile. We use it, we try to use it more for capital expenses because of that reason. If we get real estate excise tax, then we want to use it more for one-time expenditures because it is so volatile. If we rely on these types of numbers for ongoing expenses, operating expenses, it's really not a best practice because it is such a volatile source of funding and very hard to predict. But it is a general fund revenue. Amy, you have a question.
You just answered it. I was going to ask, is this separate or included in the general fund? It sounds like this is a part of that general, going and funding the general fund. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it goes to the general fund, but it can be part of those interfund transfers where then we take that money and we put it towards some other purpose. Okay, so I think that wraps up some of the basic revenues that we receive for the general fund. Any other questions before we move on to ARPA?
I had a question, Cynthia.
Yeah, Cynthia.
I was in the chat, just by the way. I'm following my own rules.
Yeah.
Do we need to know the difference between REIT 1 and REIT 2?
For our purposes, no.
Okay. Let's make time in it then. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So at this point, as we move on to ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, I will turn it over to Benton, who's going to lead us through these slides and is much better versed on ARPA than I am. Take it away, Benton.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so the American Rescue Plan Act was a piece of federal legislation passed back in March of this year, signed into law by President Biden, that provided for a number of different relief measures. The largest one you'll remember were those direct checks to the American public back in the spring, but the second largest was actually funding that went direct to states, counties, and local governments. And so the city of Issaquah got our portion of about $350 billion, which amounts to $11 million for us. And we have until the end of 2024 to appropriate that funding and through the end of 2026 to spend it. And there's 4 different eligible categories for expenditures. So the first is responding to negative impacts and negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The second, which unfortunately due to Washington state constitutional limitations doesn't really apply to us, but the second category would be premium pay for eligible workers. But as I mentioned, that's not entirely applicable to us. And then category C and category D are the 2 categories that are probably important for this task force to be aware of. So the first category C is for lost revenue for states, counties, and local governments. And the last, category D, is for direct investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So starting with that last, we can go to the next slide. So category D is specifically for infrastructure spending, water, sewer, and broadband. The water and sewer investments that cities make need to align with the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund requirements. The U.S. Treasury Department is, of course, the federal agency that gives out the guidance for all of us to follow. To determine which expenses are eligible and which aren't. And they decided to use the same criteria as the EPA, just in order for local governments to be able to more quickly and easily identify which projects are eligible. And the Treasury Department figured that the EPA was probably the best agency able to determine those metrics. In general, investments must be necessary to meet minimum health-based standards. So the word necessary is actually in the federal act, in the American Rescue Plan Act. And so the Treasury Department defined that as to meet these minimum health-based standards from the EPA. But cities can take climate change into account and provide for climate resiliency so that their water and sewer systems still provide those standard services with a changing climate. The second factor that investments need to be are, of course, unlikely to be met by the private market. And so it really needs to be necessary for the city to step in. Broadband is similar. Of course, it's not aligned with EPA standards, but it again needs to be necessary. And the U.S. Treasury Department defined that as to essentially give broadband access to areas that are underserved or entirely unserved by broadband internet, which is defined as less than 25 megabytes per second download speed and 3 megabyte per second upload speed, which if any of you have ever tested your home Wi-Fi or things like that, you'll know that those are incredibly slow speeds. And so we haven't done an analysis of every single parcel in the city of Issaquah, but we believe that it's unlikely that any sub area of the city has service that slow. So that, of course, is category D, and I can stop for any questions so far if folks have them.
It looks like Cynthia has, oh, I'm sorry, Jamie, you have a question, then Cynthia.
I think those were from the last one. I think Jason's the only new one.
Yep, looks like Jason's the only new one, yep.
All right, Jason.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator, and thank you, Mr. Koblenz. So quick question is, I know something that came up on the Recovery Task Force is Squawk Mountain and Cougar Mountain, with some of our residents up there being deeply frustrated with their broadband infrastructure. So as we continue to formulate a plan as where we want to put these ARPA funds, is that the type of discussion we're going to be eventually getting to? Like, okay, maybe we take a chunk of this money and we try to service an area where we know has connectivity issues. Is that kind of the direction we're kind of going to go as this evolves over time? Because I know it's one-time fund, so.
Yeah, it's a really good question. What we're really focused on, this task force that the mayor has asked us to do, is to look at the projects that are in the capital improvement plan and prioritize, come up with prioritization criteria, help us prioritize what's in the capital improvement plan, and provide any recommendations on additional funding to fund those priorities. Right now, we in the 2022 proposed budget, we have the administration is asking for funds to begin a broadband survey to better assess where are those needs in the city. Do we have properties that would maybe qualify for ARPA funds in this broadband? Because as Benton says, these are very low speeds, and unless they meet those criteria, then we can't use funds, ARPA funds for that. So I think what really the task before this task force is to take a look at what those existing projects are in the capital improvement plan, not to think about what other projects might be. And in terms of ARPA funds, I think the administration wants to return to council once we know a little bit more about ARPA. I think one of the things Benton's going to say is that there's a whole lot still that we're waiting on guidance. And I know I'm currently at a conference, the International City Managers Association is having a conference in Portland. That's where I am now. And everybody I've talked to has said they haven't come up with a plan for how they're going to use all of their funds because there just hasn't been enough guidance from the Treasury Department. And so I think as far as this task force and how you relate to ARPA, do you have recommendations for capital projects or how we would use ARPA funds towards capital projects? Do you think we should be looking at ARPA funds to help us pay for capital projects? Or are you thinking, you know, maybe there's other expenses the city should consider for ARPA funds? So I think that's something that we can talk about later, is use of these funds and this revenue source as it relates to our capital priorities, but not trying to come up with new capital projects, because I think we're trying to evaluate those in a different way.
Awesome. And are there any additional questions up to this point?
I had one question. This is Susan. I'd like to use the broadband just as an example. So thinking about not uses of the funds, but sources of the funds. How can we make sure that some of the projects that are included in the plan as proposed don't also appear on lists that other governmental entities are also trying to address? So I guess I'd like some direction as we move forward. Like on the broadband benefit, I got, as I'm sure all of you did, a postcard at my home saying from King County saying that I can apply if I were to qualify for funding so that I could improve my internet speed and potentially get some other qualifying devices. So it looks like King County is targeting the very same issue that is targeted here. So within the context of ARPA or others, like I mean, are other people putting money against the same issues that we're trying to put money against? And how do we make sure that we're not kind of like overlapping? And maybe that's the only example. Maybe the others are kind of like within city limits, but how do we factor in King County?
Yeah, great question. I think broadband is that example of an area where maybe multiple jurisdictions can affect and impact broadband. I think what we're really talking about are what those existing projects are in the CIP and the capital improvement plan. And those are projects that have been vetted. Those are projects that are the result of city planning and community outreach, and that they are very specific to the city. Now, certainly we partner with other entities to help fund them sometimes. Sometimes we'll get grants from King County to do that. But those partnerships are worked out really at the administration's level. So I think it goes back to what are the projects in the capital improvement plan? Those are the projects that we are charged with prioritizing, and they're really specific to the city. So I don't think we have to worry about that so much with these projects that we're trying to prioritize and having us overlap between different jurisdictions. They've already been vetted. Thank you.
Wonderful. So seeing no more questions, I'll just move on to the next slide. So category C. This is the category of eligibility for the American Rescue Plan Act that allows cities to make up for lost revenue. And the Treasury Department says that that needs to be spent on quote unquote government services. Now, the Act had specifically called out water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure investments, but other infrastructure investments might be able to fall under this category. And so specifically road and street infrastructure spending was called out in the guidance as allowable. But there may be other categories as well. I think one open question, for me at least, is some investments that fall under water, sewer, and broadband. If they're not eligible under category D, would it be possible to invest in under category C? So there's open questions like that with the guidance that we still need to determine. But in general, we know that all investments must be pay-go, so they cannot, so ARPA funds can't go to debt financing. And of course, under this category, expenditures are limited up to the amount of the city's lost revenue, which our finance department is in the process of officially calculating and will continually be updating through 2024. And of course, it cannot match other federal grants. So many federal grants come with a match from the city or state partner requirement, a requirement for a match, I should say. And ARPA funds cannot be used for that. But in general, as Deputy City Administrator Snyder alluded to, the Treasury guidance is still in its interim state. It is not yet completely finalized, and things are definitely subject to change. But many of the things that we talked about just now will certainly stay, but some of the details might be a little bit changed by the time the final guidance comes out. And so we're still awaiting those final ARPA rules from the Treasury Department, and look forward to receiving them. So I'm happy to answer any further questions about this category of eligible expenditures or the American Rescue Plan Act in general.
And perhaps while you're thinking of questions, Benton, you'll stay on for the next slide because the next slide is talking about what capital projects we're proposing in the 2022 budget to be funded using ARPA funds. And so we have included 2 capital projects in the proposed budget. One is Newport to SR 900 to Southeast 54th Street improvements, and that's $750,000 for design using ARPA funds, and then also design for the Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements, which you may refer to as the pinch point. So those are 2 things that satisfy the criteria that Benton just talked about, right? It's pay as you go. It's not debt financed. We do not have a federal grant that we would be using to pay for these phases of the projects. And so that's what we have included in the 2022 budget so far regarding capital projects using ARPA funds. And as I said, we're still trying to sort out what else can be eligible. And it's something that we're working on every day and trying to get more guidance on. But certainly any input that this task force has regarding capital projects would be very helpful. Questions? It looks like Councilmember Martz has a question.
So I have a question about some capital projects have funding sources already identified, and some capital projects do not. And Northwest Sammamish Road, non-motorized improvements, I believe does have funding already identified, does it not? And does that matter as we talk about things that are on the plan?
I think you're referring to the CIP and how we've allotted or planned for funds to pay for different stages. I am wondering if I can call upon Susie. I understand Susie Monsell, the city's budget manager, is on the line. And Susie also has a lot of expertise with the CIP in helping draft it. So I'm wondering if Susie can help answer that question as we phone a friend. And we might just kind of kill time to invite Susie into the room and see if she can speak to this.
Thank you. I'm going to unmute Susie.
Great.
So just give me a moment here. Susie, you have the floor.
All right. Hello. I don't know if I have my camera on or not, or how to turn it on from where I'm sitting. So I'll just say it verbally. Hi, I'm Susie Monsell. I'm the acting budget manager with the city. Councilmember Martz, I believe you are correct. So Northwest Sammamish Road is partially funded. So what Deputy Administrator Snyder mentioned was the capital improvement plan often discusses projects in phases. So I believe, I do not have the CIP in front of me, but if memory serves, this particular project, the Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements, has partial funding for the design phase, which is intended for 2022. The larger construction phase of the project, the much larger phase of the project, is currently unfunded. So I would defer to Deputy Administrator Snyder on the prioritization of what this task force is addressing in those sort of projects, but that gives a little context on the phasing of certain projects within the CIP.
Councilmember Martz, does that answer your question?
I think so. I think the broader question still stands, though, which is, as a body, are we intending to only look at the unfunded things where there are not already identified intended sources of revenue? Because a lot of those are just that, intended. And there's, the Bard said there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and funding can, things that look like a sure bet for funding in one time might not be. So I guess I'm just asking if we're going to treat them differently. Things that bits of capital projects, capital improvement plan projects that are all or partially funded versus things that are not funded?
Great question. We're looking at the projects that are partially funded and the projects that are unfunded, so both. Because those projects that are only partially funded will never occur unless we identify the rest of the funding sources. When we talk about prioritization, that could be part of the prioritization criteria, is to consider what's partially funded versus what's not funded at all. I think that's going to be a good part of our conversation at our next meeting when we start talking about the prioritization criteria.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions on ARPA? Unfortunately, the guidance has been so limited. I think we all have a lot of questions on ARPA. But if you have anything specific that you're wondering about, we can do our best to give you those answers. If not, then Benton, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Really
Tim had a
appreciate it.
comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please, Tim.
I was just going to chime in and say it would seem with kind of the time constraint and the boxes that this would be a shrewd way to go about making sure we leverage all the ARPA funds, right? Whether it's funded or not, we can then reassign that funding somewhere else that may not fit in the box, right? So if we have some shovel-ready projects that would be eligible for ARPA, it makes sense to me to put those at the top of the list. And these are, I think definitely worthy projects for that sort of time frame.
Good point. Okay. Great. Now we are going to move into our potential revenue sources, and these are revenues that perhaps the city has not yet levied. So before we do that, let's talk about what is a bond, what is a levy. Oh, thank you. Okay, I was a little confused on the slides. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about our previous efforts that we've made regarding bonds and levies. But before we do that, let's talk about what is a bond and what is a levy, because sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, and it's important to know the difference. So a bond is essentially a debt that we're selling to fund capital expenses. And those capital expenses, as we talked about at the beginning of this meeting, that's the major infrastructure projects like roads, like parks, like major assets, right? So the bonds are sold to fund these things that are capital expenses. And large bonds must be voter approved. There are some bonds that we can do for smaller amounts that council may approve of, but otherwise we need a vote of the people to approve a larger bond or debt for the city to take on that large debt. Bonds may be paid for through a number of means, number of sources, right? You can use property tax to pay off a debt. You can use your sales tax that you're getting to pay off those debts. You can even use grants to help pay off of a bond. But because the bond is the debt. The levy is a voter, in this context, a voter-approved tax, usually property taxes, that are above what that city council may approve. So we talked about that 1% limit, for example. It's really above that a voter would need to approve of this type of tax. Those revenues from the levy, so levy is a revenue, bond is a debt, the revenue that you get from the levy can be used for operations and maintenance, which is what O&M means, or to pay off voter-approved debt. For example, a levy that could be used to help pay off a bond. And there are many different types of levies, and they have different term limits and other provisions. And we're going to get to that a little bit later, but many different types of levies. So are there any questions about what's the difference between a bond versus a levy? Okay. Councilmember Marks.
So the type of bonds that don't go before the public, which we call councilmatic, can be a pretty sizable amount of money. You said that, you said that they're usually not as large, but I think the council's councilmatic bond authority is something in the tens of millions of dollars at this point that we have available should the council choose it. So as this group talks about capital financing, will councilmatic bond authority be on the table?
Yes, and I am forgetting what that limit is. I think there's a formula that is used to determine what exactly the city of Issaquah can do councilmatically.
Sure.
So it does change, I think, with the size of the budget, but I think it's under 20 million.
I know we haven't, the council hasn't exercised councilmatic bond authority in the 12 years that I've been on council. So what's happened is older councilmatic bond has been retired, and as that has retired, the amount that was available to council has gone up. When I started, the number was quite small. I think it was in the single digits of millions, and I'm pretty sure it might even be north of 20 million at this point, but worth understanding. And if it's part of the conversation, obviously to understand that that would go before council in the same way publicly voted bonds go before the whole public. Can't commit that 6 other people would want to support a councilmatic bond, but it's worth understanding if that's a lever that we have to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And our ever helpful budget manager, Susie, said she has some information that she can share about councilmatic bonds. Susie? Now on camera.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Now on camera. Yes, so Councilmember Martz, thank you for asking that question, because I think this is one that comes up during the budget process each year, especially in the context of what sort of general obligation, the councilmanic debt that the city can support in any given year versus how much we can legally take out by state law. And by state law, we can take out a very, very large amount of debt. The question becomes for at least general fund supported debt, how much can we support within existing revenue sources? So right now, the 22 proposed budget, as a point of reference, and I apologize, I'm slightly out of breath in that I ran to find my budget book. The 22 proposed budget includes about, actually, I believe I'm looking at the wrong page. I want to say it's around 6 million of general fund supported debt, but that's something that I'm certainly happy to follow up to provide that information to Deputy Administrator Snyder to provide to the task force.
Okay. Thanks, Susie. So to your point, Councilmember Martz, I think that is an option for this task force to discuss more and recommend the use of that authority. And so let's come back to you with more information so we can have more of a discussion on that in the second time we discuss these financing options and preferences.
Sure. Can I just follow up and make sure everybody understood what Susie said, which is that if the council said, oh, let's go do 20 million in councilmanic, sorry, I always want to say councilmanic bonding, basically that means that over some amount of time we would have to pay that off. And so each year we would have, I don't know, $1 million, $2 million less per year in the general fund to do all the normal operating things we do until that councilmanic bond authority is paid off. So that's the difference between a publicly funded bond, which is paid back by the public. The councilmanic is paid back out of city operating funds, right? Just to be clear. Thanks.
Yep, and we can come back with more information. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is exploring previous efforts the city has had when it comes to bonds and levies that were voter approved. Back in 2008, the city asked for a fire station levy, and this was to pay for Fire Station 72, our new fire station within the Central Issaquah area. associated with that levy was to pay off a $4.5 million bond. And again, that was just for construction. It was $30 per year for the next 20 years for the homeowner of a $500,000 home. And it passed with 67% approval. And from present day, here we are in 2021, it expires in 7 years. So homeowners are still paying on this levy. Yes, Jamie.
Thank you, Andrea. Is it generally the case that when a levy is, or in this case, like you have a bond and a levy coming together, basically the levy increasing the city's revenue capacity to support the new debt that it's taking on, that doesn't impact the other debt capacity restrictions that we might have, or is that oversimplified way of looking at it?
So I think that you're right. So when we take on a new expense, such as a fire station, $4.5 million fire station, and we have a new revenue that's going to pay for that new expense, then that doesn't affect the rest of our debt capacity, especially when it's a voter approved revenue.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's nice when things are simple, so I don't think it's too simple. Next slide, please. And really, the point of going over these examples of recent efforts the city has made for voter-approved bonds or levies is really so you can get an idea of what we've done, what's been successful, and how does that inform our choices and preferences moving forward, right? So 2014, we had a park bond that was $10 million over 20 years. It was to pay for pole repairs, some open space acquisitions, and park enhancements. The owner of a home assessed at $420,000 would pay $46 and change per year over the course of those 20 years. And then, yes, it did pass 77% approval, which is pretty high approval. And that bond, we're still paying off, and the bond itself expires in 12 years. Yes, Jamie.
Is there a reason the word levy is not used here?
Yes, because it was actually a bond that we passed, and then a levy was associated with that bond to help pay it off. And there's by state law, there's certain levies that we can pass if the bond itself has passed. And so bonds are, as I said in the beginning of this section of the presentation, they are discrete. They are for certain projects. There's a beginning and there's an end to those bonds. Levies, depending on the type of levy that you have, may be a little bit more ongoing. And so in this particular case, as we dive more into it, there are considerations for whether you do a bond or a levy. In this case, we did a bond because it is discrete, and that allowed us to assess an additional property tax. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next slide, please. The 2016 transportation bonds, that was proposed to be $50 million repaid over 25 years. You can see that's substantially more than the other measures that we just talked about. 33 cents per $1,000 of assessed value, and that means that it would have cost the owner of a home worth $500,000 about $165 a year over those 25 years. And as we know, it failed. It did not pass. It needed a supermajority to pass. So the 54% approval was not successful. And now I'd like to invite some members of the task force who are really involved with the transportation bond efforts back in 2016, what your observations were as to maybe why that bond didn't fail. Are there lessons that we should carry forward or that we should consider as we look to any future potential revenues? And so first, I'd like to call in Tim Flood. Tim, do you have any insights to share with us?
Yeah, Thank you very much. So, it was an effort similar to this, right? So 11 folks getting in a room, choosing from it was like this, but really focused on transportation. So a subset of our mandate here. And I thought it was 56% approval, so 54, but my biggest takeaway, it was kind of disappointing that it didn't pass. My biggest takeaway as far as why that happened. One is I think the projects that were selected were not necessarily geographically representative of the city. One thing that we looked at in that park bond that I think really made it successful was no matter where you lived in the city, you could point at one thing in there and said, okay, I don't go to the pool and swim, but this park is in my neighborhood, and so I'll support this bond. And I lobbied hard for the Northwest Sammamish Parkway non-motorized improvement to be included in that. It failed 5-5-1 abstain and didn't get in there. And I could almost guarantee it would have passed had that been in there because, the South Lake Sammamish area represents 10% of the city. That would have gotten a lot of people, excited about it. So I think as we look at our mix of projects we represent, we want to make sure that geographically it's representative of the city. I also think one of the reasons it failed is there was some voter fatigue out there. Sound Transit 1, 2, 3 were all coming and passing, and so people were paying a lot and expecting some kind of transportation improvements for those funds. In my opinion, honestly, ours would have had more of an impact in the daily life in the next 20 years for residents of Issaquah than the much larger ticket price of ST 123. But I think that played a role in it. And then I want to say our borrowing capacity at that time was like 80 million. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And we made the conscious decision to go under that, and it was in the high 40s. You put 50 on there in terms of the total ticket price. And my personal take on it was kind of go big or go home. And, I don't think we could do this, do 50 million, and then 5 years from now, go back and do another 30 million. I think you're going to have kind of one bite at the apple. And so I think if there's something that's on the cusp and it kind of sweetens the pot for some constituency in the city and you think it'll get us over the hump, then I'd say go 60 or 70 million versus 40 or 30 million, thinking that lower ticket price is more likely to get it to pass. I think it's more important to make an impact and to be geographically representative. In terms of the projects themselves, there's really one project that would have made a real impact in traffic. Everyone knows Front Street is our pain point. There still is a project scoped out there somewhere to basically create a motorized bridge through a part of a downtown neighborhood there where right now it's just foot traffic. And it was a real lightning rod. The folks in that neighborhood didn't want it, pushed back in a huge way, and we listened to them and didn't include it in the package. And so when you look at the projects that made it into the list, there were, kind of at the periphery of actually addressing congestion and traffic. And some of it was kind of a backlog of things that maybe we should have paid for already, right? And not as impactful as you might want to see in a list of projects. But we came awfully close. I think if we had that pathway on there, I think it would have passed. And I think as we put together this suggestion, I think, if it costs another additional, 10, 20 million over what that bond was in order to make sure we have projects that everybody can point to and have something that's in it for them, I think that's going to help us get over the hump versus hold us back.
Thanks, Tim. I'm curious to hear what the thoughts of some others are. I also see Brad, you have a comment. So let's go to you next, Brad.
Yeah, one's a comment about the park board bond and how that might differ from the transportation bond, and also maybe a little comment about the transportation bond and at least my opinion about success. So from the park bond, one of the things that, and I don't know that much about the transportation bond to see if you may have done similar measures, but the Parks Department actually used an outside vendor to do an assessment from the community so that we could really gather what the community felt about taking on a park bond, and also a clear distribution of various things that were to be included before the bond was actually written up. So that's partly why it was successful, because there was a very long list of things that were being proposed at that time. And so we actually, through that survey, were able to determine where the community had the highest amount of approval for certain things. And so then the bond itself was actually drafted around that, so that there was a greater chance of success. For instance, the pool, weighed pretty heavily in that survey in terms of the community feeling like that pool needed some assistance, and so so we actually specifically selected certain things that actually weighed heavily in the survey. And I think, and then the overall survey, helped, establish that the community was in support of a park bond. So that's, I don't know if there's comparisons or not. I'll leave that up to people that were more involved in the transportation bond to see if that might help in the future for something like that. My opinion about the transportation bond failure, stems from living in the community for 37 years and seeing the amount of growth that's occurred, and talking to a number of people, seeing a lot of social media comments and that type of thing. I think one of the things that is of concern, especially in transportation, a lot of these infrastructures, is I think people have the impression that growth should pay for growth. And when you see along Newport, as an example, the amount of growth that occurred over a rather large number of years and not any real improvements on Newport, I think from a long-standing resident, my opinion certainly was that a certain amount of impact fees should have been rendered to pay for a lot of those improvements. Rather than for a new debt or taxation on the existing community to pay for something. And so I think that had an impact on it. The other thing, moving forward with those kind of things that would have been helpful is that, let's say impact fees were to be included as a part of the overall cost of that project. If something could have been made clear that, let's say impact fees already accumulated were going to contribute 60% of that project, and the bond was only to contribute 40% to help support the overall project, I think the community could have seen, well, so it does look like growth is contributing to growth. But the way, as I recall that bond, it was all about that particular project was just being paid by the bond, and that there was no other resources that were actually being contributing to that project. So, I just think that moving forward for those type of bonds, it would be helpful to have some sort of a breakdown as to how much is being paid for by other resources and how much is being sought for the public to contribute to that overall project, rather than for the bond itself just be to pay for the entire project. I think that would have an impact on the community when they vote for such things. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Brad. I just want to take the opportunity to address some of the comments that you've made. The transportation bond process followed a very similar process as the parks bond. So we did do that survey of the community to assess what are the projects that are of interest to them. So that was part of the process. And we would, I think, follow that same tactic if we were to go do this again. It's a best practice. And in regards to the transportation bond, I think those projects that we're talking about with the roundabouts on Newport, between Newport, between SR 900 and Maple, or to I'm sorry, to east of SR 900 on Newport. Those projects were existing issues, and so we can't have growth pay for problems before growth came. And so that's, I think, the difference there. But we can talk more about that off of line so that you can understand. But your point is very well made about making sure that if we're asking voters to approve a debt or a new tax, to make sure that they understand how these projects are being paid for, how much of it is being paid for by the public versus other entities, whether that's grants or the private sector, et cetera. So I think it is a good point, and I've written that down as a good lesson learned. Councilmember Goodman, I know that you were part of this effort back a few years ago, so I'm wondering what other insights and lessons learned would you like to share with the group?
Sure. First of all, I think the comments so far are just very relevant and interesting, and I would agree with all of them. You know, the transportation issues are very complex, and you know, growth by state law cannot completely pay for itself, because there's the reality that there is a belief that growth brings benefits. So growth cannot, by law, just completely pay for itself. So the community has to bear some of that cost. And some of that, one of the other complications that I think we have is that, Issaquah is, we're like a regional intersection. So we're along I-90, we're bifurcated by I-90. And not only do we have growth going on here, but we have, just an enormous amount of growth over the past, 15 years happening in the south of us, and without any employment centers, and also to the north of us and in Sammamish without any employment centers. And so folks are trying to go to I-90, and that's not an issue that's, just an Issaquah issue. Every city has their own sort of traffic related issues. Newcastle has a similar issue. And so as the communities grow up, grow around us, and we're also growing here, I think what our community sees is are issues that, we're unable to really address. And that is the traffic that's going through our city. We don't have any control over that. And we also have complications with figuring out how to count that, reduce that. We see what happens when we close a street just for a short period of time, and it creates havoc for folks. And I think Brad, I think you're, in my perception, not only on the council but also as a community member, is people are, at the same time we're asking for help, they're seeing a lot of development go up in the city, and they're not exactly thrilled with that development. So I think all of that sort of played a role, and I think that I was president of the council when the council decided to vote for that bond, and my personal opinion is that we, as a city leadership, city administration, city council, were not prepared for that bond. By comparison, you have Issaquah Schools has a Volunteers for Issaquah Schools, VIS. They have, since 1977, have had a nonprofit entity of community members who support and advocate for bonds and levies for the school district, and they do a very good job. They have it's a little bit different entity. You have a lot of folks who are coalescing around the need for schools and the need for improved schools, and you have this influx of new families every year, and it's a slightly different model. But that nonprofit entity also has a mix of current school board members on it and former school board members on it, and they do a lot of I haven't been a part of it. This is my understanding, and others may have been involved that can shed more light on. My understanding is they do a lot of vetting of things before they go out. And the bonds or levies that have failed for the school district have been, I've been told, and my understanding, are ones who garner a no campaign. The 2016 bond for Issaquah immediately garnered some sort of a no campaign for us. We weren't prepared, despite the work by the committee that was working on it, that Tim was on. And, there were different opinions about what should be on that list of projects that went out to the community. But we were not prepared for that. And it rested on the shoulders of some council members to kind of get that over the finish line. So although we didn't get a super majority, we did get very close to 55%. So I feel like we were pretty close. So anyway, my first impression was that we weren't prepared for it. My second impression was that, as was touched on, and I'll be done here in a second, as was touched on by others who commented on this, it really wasn't a traffic congestion measure. And people at the time were tired of traffic congestion and development. However, the messaging that went out was about congestion. That did not resonate with people. It really was, in my opinion, should have been more about how we improve our roads in ways that are better for us, whether we have more sidewalks, better pedestrian, better bike facilities. That's not, so I think the messaging didn't resonate with people because that's not what they saw in those projects. So those were my impressions. I'm glad we got nearly 55%. I think we could do a better job next time preparing for it. I recall what Tim said, the details that that he stated about what should have been on it and what didn't make it on it. I remember all of those details. So anyway, those are my recollections. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I do have a follow-up. I know that there's lots of questions and comments that others have right now, but I have a follow-up. You said that one of the lessons learned was that City Council was not prepared for that bond. They weren't prepared for the no campaigns. I'm wondering, how can we better prepare?
Well, the city can't advocate for it. And my recollection was the day after the vote, I was informed that we needed to figure out a way to get it over the finish line. I was not prepared for that. And it was then that we started kind of backpedaling, trying to figure out what else we should have done. And that's when our lesson learned immediately was we didn't have anything akin to the VIS. That's the lesson. To me, that's a big lesson learned. We probably should have a community group, a nonprofit community group that helps the city with all of our bonds and levies, regardless of the topic. And even though we have a great track record with parks, maybe there's one for a swimming pool later in the future. I have no idea. I'm just throwing that out there. So that was a lesson. That's how we weren't prepared. We had 7 people with a recommendation of a task force, which is not the same as a nonprofit entity that advocates. And to me, that's how we were not prepared.
Okay, thank you. I know Councilmember Martz probably has a few comments he wants to add, but before we get to you, Councilmember Martz, I think we have a question from Jason Voice.
Thank you, Deputy Administrator, and I apologize for my eyes darting around. My sick little puppy finally just got up, so I'm kind of wondering what she's doing. Just 2 things really quickly is I think the previous comments from Tim and Brad and Stacy are fantastic. Obviously, a lot of us weren't around during that period of time, so very enlightening. I really appreciated what they all had to say, and I think we could probably learn a lot in taking that forward for any possible campaign for a future one. 2 things real quickly is one, I thought Brad's suggestion about how some people, if there is a way almost to kind of do like a down payment. I think people sometimes they see the sheer numbers of these things and they don't see somewhere where the city's pitching in. I think, for example, we just saw those 2 that were talking about the design possibly being covered by ARPA. It kind of shows some skin in the game. I know sometimes when I'm looking at these things and the numbers are just so astronomical and you sit there with your calculator and plug them in, and sometimes that could be just enough to kind of make you, okay, the city's, it's vested in it. So I thought that was that was a great comment. And then finally, one thing, just a point of clarification, the city can't charge impact fees on itself, can it? Now it could for WestDOT or something like that. So like Washington State Department of Transportation, I mean, there's certain things that it wouldn't make any sense for. I mean, it's one thing if a developer, you charge them an impact fee. But for like a city project or a state project cutting through the city, that's not a tool available to us, correct?
Well, right. We charge impact fees on development, and so even for WashDOT, for example, if WashDOT was going to build a building, then I think we could charge impact fees on them for that. Certain entities are exempt, but for a road project or a culvert project, we charge permitting fees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And next we have, I'm sorry, I'm going through the
comment,
chat
I
here.
promise.
Yeah, okay, Tim.
Real quick on Brad's point was really well made, right? There's a perception in the community all the way up to what Stacy said as far as there being an orchestrated no campaign, right? And so I think the perception, it was coming into that process, I sort of had a similar sort of perception, not maybe as harsh as somebody willing to campaign against a bond, but that growth should pay for itself. It's a tough pill to swallow, but the truth is it doesn't, right? And like the average voter doesn't necessarily know that. And so there's a messaging effort to go there. And I think we have to really, the two big takeaways, right, are the projects need to be very targeted so that you can see a tangible benefit, right? So in Talus, I think we could use a turn lane for Talus. In the Highlands, we could use speed bumps and a parallel road. In South Lake Sammamish, that parkway, right? And Newport. So look and really do something targeted. And I think those projects, a turn lane to Talus doesn't do anything for pass-through traffic, but it helps people that live in Talus, and we're more likely to get them on board if we can pull that off, right? And so look at projects there. I don't know if it's on the CIP, but I think something that we should consider is kind of addressing the last mile problem, getting people from our population centers to existing transit centers. So getting people from Talus and the Highlands to the existing park and rides that are out of space. If there's something we can do in terms of funding within this or outside of this, I think that would help as well. But impact fees don't pay for growth, and as much as we want them to, and even if they did, like this day forward, we've kind of had this. The reality is we've dug ourselves this hole of this backlog of projects that the past growth didn't pay for, and so we're going to have to pay for them sometime, or they're never going to get done. And so, not a message the average voter wants to hear. It's tough to deliver, but I think we have to do really targeted projects so there's something tangible in it for everybody, and then really focus on our messaging and maybe engage those no campaign folks in here and say, what would you vote for? There's going to be some segment of society that are the voters that will just never support anything because they think that developers should have had to pay for that. I'm not going to pay for that, and I'll sit in traffic rather than pay for it. But I think there's 60% or more we can get there if the projects and the messaging are right. And I'll be done. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate your insights. Councilmember Martz.
Thanks.
Tina, can you do me a favor and put down the slide? I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
So actually, for many years before I got onto the city council, I was involved with Issaquah School District levies and bonds, both on levy and bond development committees and as an officer of volunteers for Issaquah Schools, which does the advocacy side. Councilmember Goodman is right. It is a very different effort over there. It is a well-oiled machine. VIS works in parallel to the development committee. They hire consultants very early in the process to map out strategies. But I'm going to be careful to limit my thoughts on the development effort rather than the advocacy effort, which I have very strong opinions about, but it's not really the subject of things tonight. So Issaquah School District has very structured levy bond development efforts. To give an idea how structured they are, they hire an outside facilitator. It's a series of, 3-hour meetings. I'm going to say it's 8 or so of them. You get, for instance, it's such a large group. You have teachers from every school. You have PTA reps from every school. The outreach is really they cover the district very well. So speaking about the 2016 transportation bond, my view is that a couple of things. We had sort of a wonky process, right? We said, well, we're going to kind of pick the orphan projects, right? We see this money out there. I mean, we see all this $300 million worth of need, and we're going to pick the things that we think are important, but that they don't have money available for them. But it was a criteria that led to, the proverbial redheaded stepchild, like a bunch of things that didn't necessarily have much advocacy in the community. I totally agree with Councilmember Goodman about the bond was not seen as addressing the fundamental congestion problems that we had in the city. I will also say there were no big ambitious projects. There was no moon launch, right? With school district bonds, you get schools, right? They say, vote for this bond, you will get a shiny new school. Vote for this bond, you will get sports stadiums, right? And if people can have various opinions about sports stadiums, but they're very popular with parents. So, I agree. I think Tim said, we should swing big. We should move, we should look to move the needle. We should look to come up with something that, people can envision in their head and go, oh my gosh, that would make such a difference in the city, rather than a collection of, like I said, redheaded stepchilds. The Third Avenue extension was, I think it was and I apologize to anybody who was a big advocate of it, but I think it was an incredible distraction. I don't think the council would have ever approved it. I don't know how much people know, but there is just a general rule in municipal government. You don't close existing roads, and you don't connect roads that aren't connected. It's an extraordinarily, incredibly divisive issue. And I think it created a lot of churn that was unnecessary, because the council would, like I said, would have never approved it. I almost wondered at the time whether it was thrown in as a sacrificial lamb, so that it could be then removed and seen as a sop to public opinion. And finally, the last thing I'll say is about no campaigns. The general rule, those consultants that everybody hires, the expensive consultants will tell you, there's 25% of the population that will absolutely vote no to any tax, any bond, any levy, anything. So you really have, it's the other 75%, right? For a bond, to get to 60% of the overall population, you need to get 80% of that 75% that's left, right? The 75% that are persuadable, you have to get 80% of that. And that's where no campaign really hurts you a lot. Now, for a levy, because you only have to get to 50% plus 1, you need to get 2/3 of that 75%. So it's 80% of the persuadable for a bond versus 2/3 for a levy. And again, that's why it's generally held that on a bond, if you get a no, it's extraordinarily difficult to put a bond through. With levies, it's more doable if a no campaign comes up. And I think the question out of 2016 that haunts everybody is, what if it had been a levy? What if it had been structured differently? And it would have been less money up front, but it would have been a source of revenue. I don't know if we could have borrowed against that levy, probably not. But it would have been 50% plus 1 instead of 60%. So those are my thoughts.
One note though, that Third Street extension was not in our recommendation. It got pulled before it got to council, right? So, and there was just in like the minutes of the meeting, people caught wind that was under consideration, and showed up in force to let their opinions be known. So, but I agree exactly. That's a lightning rod, and so we've got to be very cognizant of that as we try and get the majority.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all of those insights. Really great discussion we've had. More of a robust discussion than I had anticipated, but I think it's really good and a discussion we needed to have. So thank you for that. Looking at the time, it's 7:40. We only go till 8, and I want to keep that promise with you. We have a ton more slides to cover, but I'd rather skip those at this point. You have information in your packet in the slides. There's also a potential revenues table that was provided in your packet that compares these potential future revenues side by side. So you can see certain features of each of these and what each kind of would provide or what some of their restrictions might be. So I'd refer you to that table. Please look at that now. That's linked from your agenda packet. While you're pulling that up, I realized that there's one thing I didn't say in advance of this discussion, which was a question that Councilmember Hall had raised last time, which was concerns over what we can discuss over city infrastructure about the failed vote. And we're not campaigning, so there's no proposal before the voters. Council hasn't approved any proposal. We are so far from that and may not get there. So it's really just talking about facts and what happened and impressions of what happened in the past. So the whole conversation is certainly within the realms of the law and PDC guidance. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, and I'm sorry I didn't address that beforehand. So with that all said, hopefully that gave you time to pull up the chart. And, you know, like I said at the beginning of this meeting, one of the things I really wanted to make sure that we had time to do today is gather questions. And so as you think about these lessons that we just discussed, and that we will be looking to this task force for recommendations. Do we pursue any of these potential revenue options? That's a question. If we do, which ones would you recommend? Those are the questions before this task force when it comes to revenue options. And looking at this table and this chart that's in front of you, I'm wondering, what more information do you need to know? Because we really, and I see Tina just put a link to it in the chat. Thank you so much, Tina, so helpful. So in case you're having trouble finding that table. So looking at that table, and hopefully you're able to look at the slides ahead of this evening, what other pieces of information do you need to know? Because I really didn't want to overwhelm you too much tonight. Obviously a lot of information to cover, but I assume you need more information. So, so what else? I see Brad. We'll call on you first, and then Tim. Saw you raise your hand, Tim.
Well, you know, frankly, at least as it relates to parks, one thing really stuck out to me is this metropolitan park district as far as potential future revenue. It does not appear that that's something that the city has exercised yet, but looks like it's got some rather substantial numbers to it. One clarification that I'd like about that is it looks like, at least from the chart, it only says for acquisition and maintenance. Does it go beyond that in terms of development? You know, I mean, it's one thing to acquire land for a park, it's another to actually turn it into a park. And so can those funds actually be used to develop a park once the acquisition of land has occurred? So that's one big question, because the way the chart says that can't happen. It only once it's developed, then you can maintain it, but you can't use those funds to develop it. So I see your head is shaking. Yes, Andrea, does that mean?
I believe it's inclusive of development.
Okay. So that's a huge issue there. One other thing that's not necessarily related to this, but something that I have as a question to maybe look for some clarity is that, so it's my understanding that the 2022 and 2023 CIP, they do have funding sources for what's on the CIP for those 2 years, if I'm correct. One of the things I would like to actually see is there some sort of an allocation breakdown of revenue sources for those things that have already been funded. That would help actually determine, where the gaps are and where maybe some additional resources could be pursued. I mean, as it stands, when I look at, let's say, what's funded for 2022, I don't know where what resources are being extracted to pay for all of that, all those projects. And it would be nice, is 90% of it coming from the general fund, or are there specific fund, like impact fees, or is 10% being paid for by impact fees and 90% by the general fund? Or, there's a variety of resources that are paying for these capital improvements, and it would be nice to see what kind of a breakdown there is, to see where that money's coming from.
And Brad, just so that I could make sure that what information we come up with is helpful to you, how would that breakdown be helpful? How would you be using that in your recommendations moving forward?
Well, I guess to see whether or not there needs to be some potential recommendations for changes where that money should be coming from differently. I like, if everything is coming from the general fund, then we might need to take a look at that. If a substantial amount is coming from impact fees, then we could take a look at that, whether or not, potentially more could come from impact fees. What's the relationship from revenue resources to pay for projects, I guess. And once you have that kind of a breakdown, then you can kind of see to some extent where we might try and pursue additional resources outside of it. Right now, I don't even know. I'm still kind of learning where the resources are that is paying for these projects. Where's that money coming from? And for instance, parks also contributes a good bit of revenue to the city from a variety of resources that the parks has. It would be good to know whether or not some of that money is actually coming back to parks, or is it just going to the general fund and being utilized elsewhere. And we started a fund for replacement of pad 3 up at Central Park, for instance, as an alternative. That just started a couple years ago, and has been very helpful to enable that to be resurfaced. So again, having a bit of a breakdown to really see where all this money is coming from would be helpful to see where future money might be able to come from. Does that clarify, Andrea? Or?
It does. Thank you. That's helpful. Okay. I think I said Tim was next. You had your hand raised.
Yeah, I'll be succinct. So that transportation bond, where would that fall in this table? Is that outside of this table in terms of funding sources?
Good question. With a transportation bond, I think we'd also be looking at a levy, whether that's an excess levy or a levy lift to help pay for the bond. So we could consider them in tandem, but we still would need to identify a revenue source to pay off that debt.
And then my quick question, and I'll be done for the night, I promise, is what is that? What is our capacity, right? So before, I think it was in the neighborhood of 80 million, but that top line number of our borrowing capacity is a really salient point to what we decide on for our priorities.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. And then I think we have Councilmember Hall with a question.
Yeah, thank you. This is Zach Hall. I actually have two quick questions. The first one has to do with just a clarifying question, and feel free to bring more information back at a future meeting if that's easier, about the transportation benefit district. So I know there are two options for revenue types there, sales tax and vehicle tabs, but I was also under the impression that the sales tax, that it was an option under the transportation benefit district for councilmanic authority under the 0.2% rate. Is that correct? And if we need to come back at a future meeting, we can.
I may need to go and confirm, because I knew that there was that option with the vehicle license fee, so it's $20. But I'll need to confirm that with the sales tax as well.
Okay, I could be remembering that wrong, but I thought maybe it would be councilmanic authority up to 0.1% and then a vote of the people up to 0.2, but I might be wrong about that. And then also just for the edification of the group, I emailed Andrea a question about the parks revenue sources, revenue opportunities earlier today, and she gave me a really good answer. So I was hoping if you could quickly break down the differences between a park bond, a city park bond, as compared to, establishing a metropolitan parks district and having a park levy through that.
Great. The park bond is taking on debt. It's discrete debt. There's beginning and middle, or there's beginning and end to that payment. So it would be for certain capital projects as we outlined in the bond measure. The Parks Metropolitan District is more ongoing. So there isn't necessarily an end. It would be an additional taxing authority, a taxing district that could pay for ongoing maintenance, for example, is one of the eligible expenses, whereas a bond, you don't really have that ongoing capability. So it would be, the Parks District would be an additional property tax, and it would have an ongoing effect to pay for parks priorities. Great. And Susan, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to ask what may be a naive question, so I ask your forgiveness on it. But do we have in our capabilities the possibility of looking at possible revenue sources that are not even listed here, that actually don't come from our citizens? And what I'm thinking specifically are arrangements with businesses, potentially with sponsors, to identify specific projects that might bring benefits to them and us. So again, just picking an example, a park, a pool, something like that. Do we have the ability to even explore the concept of offering naming rights, public-private, co-sponsorship investments, anything like that? Or are we strictly limited to what's on this page?
I think that is a great question. And it's something that we can come back with maybe some examples, because as we talk about these public-private partnerships, they usually don't pay for the whole project, right? They'll pay for a portion of the project. And so if, for example, we want a new roof on the pool, or an expanded pool, or an additional pool in the city of Issaquah, then we, to identify a private business that would build that for exclusively city use, I think is not going to happen. So they would probably, it's something that we can consider to help pay for some of a project. And I think that's something that we can look for examples of where that's occurred, and what typically the proportion of those funds could come from that private partnership. That's something that we can investigate a little bit more. Ultimately, though, we would still need to identify where do the rest of the funds come from. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
And Brad says in the comments that the skate park is a good example. So Brad, did you want to expand upon that?
Well, much like you just said, it really doesn't. A lot of those outside revenue sources is really more of an icing on the cake than than the majority of it. And so the skate park, as an example, the majority of it was funded through a variety of sources, but there were some private contributions, that helped get us over the total. So I don't think that those are kind of project oriented to some extent. I think it's kind of hard to plan for that. I think once you have a project and once you see that the major funding is available, then you can start seeking some of those additional resources to maybe take you over the top, or to maybe add some things that you were having to pull out because you didn't have enough funding. But I don't think that those are the kind of resources that you can really, plan on. So I guess and the skate park would be an example. I think that was over a $500,000 project, and I think outside resources was, maybe less than $50,000 or somewhere around that. So.
I think that's a great point, and something to also consider for the next conversation we have around criteria. And so it could be, I heard Councilmember Martz talking about lessons maybe to carry forward for any future levy or bond measure is to have something really exciting. Are there projects that are so exciting that we can have a private partnership that they'll be able to lend some money to it or to their name to it or something? And so maybe that's a criteria, maybe it isn't, but something also to consider. But to plan for that money, I think is difficult. Jamie, you have a comment?
Yeah, one of the things as I look at this table that I think would be helpful for me would be kind of start to end. So obviously I would expect something that requires voter approval to take longer, but if there's any way to quantify the start to end to just get something either approved or through the process to actually start funding something. Because I think I do a lot of financial modeling in my day job, and I think as I'm thinking about what we would want to look at down the road is, okay, we have these funding sources. Some of them are a one-time, like a bond that you're going to get a bunch of cash at a given point in time. Others are going to require you putting them in place and then building up a piggy bank. And so I think that's the thing that as we look to making more substantive decisions, I'm requesting, I think, is something that those data points that help us fill in what that model, how that piggy bank would build up for different types of uses with these different revenue sources.
Great, thank you. Councilor Martz.
Thank you. For a quick question and then maybe a comment. Are future year projects part of the capital plan fair game? There's a section in the plan that's got future year projects. I asked because people brought up the pool, and one of the future year projects is an aquatic center. And I realize time is short, but are we still under the terms of the King County Trust legal edifice around the pool? Last time we talked about the pool, because it was built with King County money, King County Trust program, there were basically all sorts of impediments to doing anything other than essentially repair work to the existing pool.
To my knowledge, yes, we are still under that. Through that program, I think we have been able to accomplish different things by just getting King County to agree and give us permission to do things. And so we'd have to, depending on what that plan is, talk to King County and see what really our true limitations are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cynthia.
This is a super interesting discussion, and I'm just really listening and taking in a lot. I want to comment about something a little bit more conceptual. So there's actually a request here for information, but buried in this. But just I think that the theme, anything that has to be voter approved, this theme of growth paying for growth and people being frustrated with growth, and it just seems like it's something that is going to keep coming back. And I think it would be really interesting to hear just a little bit more about impact fees for those of us that aren't super on top of it. And I think that the magnitude, some of the case law surrounding what you can and can't do. I know there's a history. There's strategies. There's political. There's just all kinds of things that go into what impact fees are. But I think if we were all a bit more educated, and not only, and I'm sure that a lot of people on here are already quite educated and don't need to learn more, but I think there could be some value in us having an answer, because I think the impact fees is really it's kind of a metaphor for being frustrated with growth and this concept of growth paying for growth. And I think it'd be really useful if we all understood both limits and how impact fees are being used now, and also had a common language and a common understanding, because this group will then turn around and probably be fairly key, influencers for anything that may go forward after we, make a recommendation. So I think that spending a small amount of time helping us all get on board with this concept of how growth pays for itself at this point, and I think impact fees, or if there's anything else that would be included in this concept of growth paying for growth. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, and I think I have it written down in 4 different places in my notes as something we need to talk about for next time. And so we are a little over time, so I'd like to wrap up at this point. If you have more questions, as you take a look at that table, as you maybe flip back through the slides, you're saying this isn't clear, or what other information you want to have ready for our next discussion on capital finance, please email me or discuss it with our chairs, because we really want to make sure that we have an informed discussion and that you're getting all the answers and information that you need. For next time, as we talk about our next meeting, this is really where we pivot. So despite the things that we didn't get to today, we're still going to pivot because I need some time to package up all this financial information for you. And we're going to talk about priorities and what the prioritization criteria are. We're going to talk about what we've already heard from our public feedback and input that we've gotten from the public that might help us guide those priorities and create those criteria. And at that point in time, I'd like to bring back some of those discussions and suggestions that you had from last time about how to engage the public through this process and bring them in. Because as we talk about prioritizing projects, obviously they're a big piece of that puzzle. And so, so those are discussions that we'll pivot to next time while I package up more of this financial information for you in preparation of our next financing discussion. So that'll be an opportunity for us to take a little bit more look at those buckets of projects and what we've learned so far is important to the community. And I think this context today about what the lessons learned are for bonds and levies moving forward will also really help shape some of that conversation on criteria too. So thank you for a great conversation, great discussion tonight. Any questions before I hand it back to our wonderful chair? Okay, thank you.
So it looks like you kind of covered 5. I mean, are there any other announcements besides just the next meeting? Okay, well, that sounds like we're adjourned. I think that this is a super interesting discussion. I think I did hear Andrea say that ending on time is important. And so until such time as we decide that we have too much work and that we want to add either meetings or go later, I think that we should just try to, we'll just have to push things out if we're not getting to it, because I think that discussion was well worth pushing the agenda around. But I think until we make a change, we will commit to ending on time and then have a discussion about what to do with any unleft items, whether we have to call for other meetings or do something else to address anything that doesn't get addressed. But let's just commit to ending on time. So thank you all. See you next time.